Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, can symbols contain evil within them?
That's a good question. The Buddha teaches us that certain symbols, such as the Dharma wheel, can contain truth and awakening within them. So it must be the case that symbols can also contain and convey pain and affliction.
I suppose a lot of it has to do with the associations and conceptions that people apply to the symbol. There are no symbols of truth or of hate without action by people.
That's true. The Buddha enlightens and awakens people under the symbol of the Dharma wheel. Without his action, the symbol would be unintelligible, just a shape or a mark.
So it follows that if somebody were to commit evil acts under a symbol, it would come to contain and convey hate and evil.
Absolutely right. And once this has happened, it can be difficult, maybe even impossible, to purify all of that hate and evil and make a symbol be neutral or positive again.
Agreed.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the history of the swastika symbol in Buddhism. What is the history of the swastika? What does it mean? Why and how was it taken up by hate groups? Let's get started.
What is the history of the swastika symbol?
While today it is most recognizable as a Nazi symbol, the swastika is actually much older, predating even Buddhism by a great deal of time. So let's jump to a bit of history before Buddhism arrives on the scene. We're going to give an etymology of the word and then a brief description of examples of the symbol we see across history. The word swastika is a Sanskrit word with at least 3 different components. The first is su, which means goodness, wellness, or health. The second is asti, which is a copula, or a word meaning there is, or it is. The third component, ka, could mean a number of different things. It could mean mark or symbol. It could be a grammatical component that conveys tense or case, such as the various conjugative endings of words in Romance languages. Or it could mark it as an adjective or a descriptive word. Thus, the whole word and the associated symbol means something like good luck, good fortune, well-being, good health, etc., at least in the Sanskrit context. Some late 19th and early 20th century scholars think that it could have been a greeting that conveys the same meaning as when we say good day or goodbye. It's a sign that we want to begin and end an interaction with another person in peace and good faith, and that we mean the other person well. However, a lot of this etymology is shaky at best. The primary reason is that the lexicon with all of this explanation was written by a French scholar named Émile Barnouf, who was involved in a bunch of race science and anti-Semitic stuff that even predates Nazism by a little bit. When the Nazi Party was later founded during his lifetime, he even wrote to the founding members stating he wanted the symbol for the Nazi Party to be the swastika very early on, and this was happening perhaps even before he wrote the Sanskrit dictionary. So understand that we're starting from a very tainted well. Many think that the swastika is a solar symbol, where the center of the symbol is like the North Star or the sun, and the arms spreading out from it represent the turning of the earth, or the turning of the heavens in the sky. Think of a long exposure photo of the sky at night, where the stars leave long trails. I think that this is possible for some of the symbols in history that we have looked at and called swastikas, but certainly not all of them. There was and still is a trend to look at ancient stuff and think that it was an attempt to chart out the sun or the stars because we commonly think that the sun and stars were centrally important to ancient peoples' religions and cultures. They were this important and significant in many notable cases, but it's unfair and untrue to generalize and to look upon everything we see in the ancient world with this bias that it must be related to the sun and stars. We look at Stonehenge, the pyramids, and other ancient sites and think that because they are oriented directionally, they must be astrological, and therefore must mean that the people who built them worshipped the sun and stars. This bias applied by colonial scholars results from those notable cases where the sun and stars were deities in a culture's pantheon. They unduly magnified a trend of thinking that all polytheistic people worship the sun and stars, and they derisively wrote off ancient peoples as being primitive because they were polytheistic. They believed that these ancient peoples' polytheism was both a cause and an effect of their being less technologically advanced than European powers, which had had an industrial revolution and were Christian. So if colonial scholars went somewhere far from Western Europe, they already expected the people there to worship the sun and the stars. They argued this was one of the stages of societal development that came before societies advanced to a stage of industry and Christianity. Swastikas come in many varieties and are some of the oldest symbols in human history. We have swastikas dated as far back as 6,000 or 10,000 BCE, so it is there with some of the earliest forms of human writing and art. These swastikas have many different meanings, connotations, and contexts throughout history. For one thing, there are a lot of symbols in ancient art that are being called swastikas that I highly doubt are swastikas. I think because swastikas are a thing, people look at symbols that look similar, and the first thing that their brain jumps to is swastika, even if they're from a very different context. Nevertheless, we have examples of swastikas on pottery, cave walls, and carvings in caves, and archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. It seems to have been an incredibly common symbol with lots of meanings and specific associations that vary across cultures. For some, it might have been a fertility symbol, while for others, it was perhaps a representation of the sun. In Iron Age Europe, between around 1200 to 550 BCE, it was found adorning ships, armor, jewelry, and clothes, and it represented various things depending on the culture in question. There's a lot we don't know about swastika-like symbols in history, but since we know quite a lot about what it means in the present, it's very easy to read some of that back into the past and make the mistake of thinking that it was indeed a swastika that you're looking at, and that it had X, Y, or Z connotation or meaning at the time. To make matters worse, there's a lot of modern pseudoscience, pseudo-archaeology, and pseudo-history out there that leads to a lot of misinformation about things like the swastika. This is entirely due to the lack of knowledge we have about the symbol in ancient times, and is made worse by modern fascists spreading propaganda about the symbol. The gaps in what we know often lead to wild speculation about what we don't know. Ancient Aliens-type television shows, for example, will constantly conflate correlation with causation. This leads to an idea that because things that look like swastikas exist across many different languages and cultures, they are evidence that we are visited by aliens, or that there was a grand world-spanning ancient civilization that was lost in some apocalyptic event who spread the swastika symbol, or some other wild and unprovable claim. Modern Nazis are invested in this sort of idea because they argue that the swastika being ubiquitous across history means that the symbol of their party is pure and original to human nature, rather than being the latest co-opted symbol of hate and bigotry. They think that it gives their movement and their idea some gravitas and credibility. Unfortunately, a lot of academic study and information about swastikas is tainted by this worldview. In the late 19th century, people studying swastikas were making use of European imperial and colonial paths to obtain and hoard knowledge, and then early 20th century people who were engaging with swastikas were co-opting it as a hate symbol. So really, there isn't much reputable scholarly information about it out there. Keep that in mind as we go through this episode. Most of everything we know and think about the swastika is going to be strongly influenced by and filtered through the work of European colonial scholars who had super problematic biases, and by the work of Nazis. Speaking to its role in Buddhism, the swastika is representative of the footprints of the Buddha. One of the 32 auspicious marks of a wheel-turning king, or the Mahapurusha in Sanskrit, is Dharma wheel handprints and swastika footprints. It's one of many aniconic representations of the Buddha himself across Asia, and you'll often see left-facing swastikas on statues of the Buddha's chest, on temple art, on signage, and in Buddhist sacred spaces in general. Some argue that it represents impermanence and the cycle of samsara because it has a rotational movement to it, and because it is thought of as homologous with the Dharma wheel. In this capacity, it is very significant in Asian culture. It will frequently decorate sacred spaces and even icons of the Buddha himself.
What does the swastika symbol mean?
Across different cultures and throughout history, it has had tons of different meanings. From the solar or astrological meaning I mentioned earlier, to the cycle of samsara and impermanence. When it entered the Chinese and Japanese language in the early 7th and 8th centuries, it came to represent good fortune and good luck, but also a way of referring to a Taoist concept called the 10,000 things. This is shorthand for everything in all of reality, which is very important for Taoism. For more on that, I recommend checking out my Asian religion series on Taoism. Swastikas also have a connotation of longevity and infinitude in Chinese and Japanese because it represents the unending cycle of birth and death in Buddhism, or the unending progression of the Tao in Taoism. The swastika can accordingly be found all over Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhist sacred sites. There are tons of temples in these places where there will be a swastika on an icon of the Buddha, in the art or the decoration of the temple, or sometimes even in the name of the temple. To this day, when you look at Google Maps in East Asia, the symbol denoting a Buddhist temple is a left-facing swastika, or a manji, as it's called in Japanese.
It also comes up in related media in Asian cultures. So there was a card in the Pokemon card game that in the original Japanese that has a manji symbol on it that when it gets translated to English, that symbol is changed in the art because, a Westerner looking at that is going to be like, what is a swastika doing on a Pokemon thing? I have a vague recollection, and a couple of other people I've talked about this share it, of the Pokemon Kadabra having a swastika on his forehead. Kadabra now has a star on its forehead, but we recall art very early on that was a swastika instead. We have not been able to find that image, but I asked multiple people who remember this as well, so there's something we remember like that. But the final point is, when you see something, especially from an Asian culture, with a swastika on it, that's not the Nazi swastika, necessarily.
Like many other symbols that were taken up by hate groups in Europe in the 20th century, the swastika generally had a positive or a neutral meaning, at least in Asia. It was a good luck or doctrinal symbol meant to convey specific religious meaning. For example, many families and clans in Asia used to use symbols as their family logo or seal, and many families in Japan used the swastika at one time or the other for its auspicious meaning and its connotation with good fortune, long life, and Buddhist teaching. This is similar, in my view, to the prevalence of pine tree imagery in China and Japan. The pine tree is a symbol of immortality and long life in Taoism, so it is often depicted at or near images of royalty or icons of royalty in China or Japan. This is a visual way of saying, "Long live the emperor." Similarly, having the swastika as a family symbol is like saying, "Long live the Tsugaru clan," or something like that. Now, of course, the meaning of the swastika has completely changed. Thanks to the Nazis, it is a symbol of hate and bigotry, an invitation to the world that whoever is wearing it or showing it should be punched really hard, preferably in the face.
To be clear, we're technically not saying you should punch them, just that they really deserve to be punched.
This new meaning of the symbol has caused a lot of controversies since World War II. People from the West are not really taught about the swastika in schools, or if they are, it is only in the context of the Nazi Party. So they grow up and travel to places like India, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, where there are swastikas in a lot of holy and sacred places, and they think that it's an indicator that the people there align with Nazis, but that's a total misunderstanding. While it's entirely valid and understandable to feel a bit of a trauma response when seeing that symbol due to its affiliation with the Nazi Party, one must also realize that it is the Nazis who misused it in the past and who continue to misuse it today, not the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain temples. For these religions and for Asian cultures, it is not a hate symbol. There are bigoted and hateful groups in Asia who use the swastika in an anti-Semitic context, but if you visit a 900-year-old temple and see a swastika as part of the wood or stonework, it isn't trying to make anybody feel unwelcome. The symbol predates World War II. This is especially true of the left-facing swastika. To my knowledge, that version of the swastika is not commonly used in any anti-Semitic contexts.
Why and how was the swastika taken up by hate groups?
This is a question that's a little bit frustrating, because we could ask it for any symbol they grabbed up. Why did they take up the Nordic runes? Why did they take up the Black Sun? Why did they take up the Celtic Cross? They did this because they wanted to look cool. They wanted to give their movement the air of credibility from ancient times. They had some warped misinterpretation of the symbol's meaning, etc. The answer to this question has a self-purported mystical and fantastical answer from the occultists that were involved with the Nazi Party, but the real answer is super mundane and boring. To start with the mystical, fantastical answer from the occultists, we should talk about that occult movement. There was an entire movement within and around Nazism of radicalized occultism and esotericism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was called Ariosophy. And it had this obsession with the ancient and pure roots of what they decided was the Aryan race. It also had an obsession with the magical power of runic symbols and, as I said, esotericism in general. These people were genuinely after supernatural advantages and magical powers to advance their Nazi platform. This movement believed that there was an ancient ancestral origin point for the white race of Europe, and they had perfect culture, perfect language, perfect politics, and perfect bodies. And all other races on Earth were on a level with animals or Neanderthals. These white peoples are said to have settled in the northern regions of Europe, such as Scandinavia, explaining why this group took up the Nordic runes. And they also settled in the Great British Isles, explaining the Celtic Cross. And they also settled in Germany, Poland, and France, etc., explaining the whiteness and superiority of Germany. The Nordic runes are said to have such special power because Norse gods like Odin and Thor were actually a part of this mythical, original race of Aryans, and they created the runes. This is why you see the runes being such an important part of Nazi symbolism, and why these Neo-Asatru groups in Scandinavia are typically white supremacists. This ancient race is said to have originated in the Levant, the birthplace of Christianity, and the setting of the Bible, which is why Christianity and white Jesus are also such important aspects of Nazism and white supremacy as well. There being this Levantine connection is also why you might see some Middle Eastern or Central Asian symbology in there as well, such as the swastika. So their argument was that the swastika was auspicious. It situated the Aryan race in the center of the cosmos, and it had connotations of longevity and vitality. The Nazi Party founders' sacred knowledge about that fact was why they chose it as the symbol of the party. The truth is that the symbol was a good luck symbol that was widely used in Europe before the foundation of the Nazi Party. There are lots of family crests and coats of arms with swastikas in Europe prior to the foundation of the Nazi Party and prior to the anti-Semitic movement in World War II. At its center, it has a cross, and so it had a Christian connotation in Europe as well. So it was used on coats of arms, but also on decorations and on regional flags and much more, until it became so strongly associated with Nazism. A present-day analog may be red hats in the US or in North America more broadly. Before 2015, red hats didn't mean anything, and it was perfectly common for people to wear them. Then Donald Trump started selling Make America Great Again hats that were red as part of his campaign. And now, even without seeing if there's any writing on it, my heebies get a little bit GB'd whenever I see somebody walking around with a red hat on. I've even started seeing Donald Trump's base be called collectively the Red Hats. Another modern example is the letter Z in the Russia-Ukraine war. Z is just a letter in the alphabet, but it's come to be associated with strong support for Russia in their aggression on the Ukrainian people. We're seeing in real time how hate groups take positive or neutral symbols and transform them into something evil.
This concludes our episode on the swastika in Buddhism and in general. Join us next week where we will be discussing bodhicitta. What is bodhicitta in Buddhism? Isn't it technically a desire? How does one arouse bodhicitta? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Shout out to our patrons, Tanner, Wooly, and Adine. We really appreciate your support. It means a lot to us. We are shutting down our Patreon at the end of this year. If it's still 2024 when you're listening to this, you can go to patreon.com/writeonbuddhism to read our explanation. For folks who want to support the show, stay tuned. We have started plans for something next year. Once more, we're glad you're listening, and special thanks to our patrons.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.